So picture this. You're a newlywed and you travel all the way to a beautiful paradise for what was supposed to be an amazing time with your new husband. But then that dream turns into terror when the husband you recently exchanged IDs with beats you to death and leaves your body in a pool of blood in a hotel bungalow. It's hard to imagine, right? It truly sounds like it's out of a scary movie. But that's what happened to Christy Chen when she was on her honeymoon with her new husband, Bradley. That was back in 2022. Now we're in 2025, and Bradley just learned his fate, and the judge who sentenced him isn't sparing any type of kindness or sympathy. And rightfully so, because these details are horrible. So Bradley and Christy said I do to one another in February of 2022. For a lot of people, it's the most exciting time of your life, early marital bliss. And like most couples who get married, you go on a honeymoon. They weren't going to stay in Memphis, Tennessee, where they're from. They hopped on a plane to Fiji. Now, it wasn't right after they got off the altar. It was a few months later in July. Oh, and the exclusive resort they were staying at was the same resort where the 1980 film The Blue Lagoon starring Brooke Shields was filmed. The perks of staying at the Turtle Island Luxury Resort added to the paradise. The resort offered private villas, gourmet meals, and a personal concierge. So you can imagine how horrifying it was for this to be the scene of a gruesome crime. On July 9th, Christy and Bradley missed their breakfast, then their lunch. But later that afternoon, they found out why. Christy was found lifeless in a pool of her own blood inside one of the resort's bungalows. It's terrible, right? And it was one of the resort's staffers who discovered her. Now, previously, an attorney for Christy's family said Christy and Bradley were arguing the night before over dinner. So was this a terrible accident? Sure, you can argue both of them were drinking and maybe not in their right state of mind, but it seemed intentional. Officials say Christy had multiple blunt force injuries to her head. An autopsy showed Christy had swelling around both of her eyes, across her mouth, her right arm was covered in cuts and bruises, and she had a large gaping wound on her back. But here's the thing though, Bradley was still nowhere to be found. But when you're on an island, you couldn't have gone that far, right? Well, Bradley tried to. He fled the resort on a kayak and paddled to another island. He only took a few items with him, and by a few I mean his wallet and passport. He didn't take his phone or even his watch because of GPS tracking, but authorities still managed to track him down 36 hours later. How? Because he got stuck on a remote island, so maybe he didn't think his escape all the way through. So Bradley's lawyer previously told the Associated Press his client left the resort because he panicked and was in shock about his wife losing her life. But you can't help but think, was it shock over losing Christy or shock he might go to jail forever in Fiji? So ultimately, he was thrown in jail and charged with Christy's murder. Now, remember how I mentioned Christy was beaten to death? Well, her body was so badly beaten, she couldn't be embalmed for her remains to be returned to the U.S., so they had to cremate her. So Bradley claimed this was an accident, the accident being she fell down while drunk and inflicted her own injuries, and he pleaded not guilty. And remember, this happened in Fiji, so he was going to be tried in Fiji. But that trial wouldn't take place until 2 years later, just last year. It lasted about a week, and it shouldn't be a surprise he was found guilty. The judge said no one else was responsible for Christy's death. In their ruling, the judge wrote, "From the totality of the evidence, I am satisfied the prosecution has disproved the defense of provocation. Having considered all the evidence in its totality, I am of the opinion that the prosecution has proved the charge of murder against the accused beyond reasonable doubt." So that was a few months ago. Now, the same week of Valentine's Day, Bradley learns his fate and came face to face with Christy's family. But not as they were cheering him on and Christy for getting married, but hoping they get justice for Christy. Christy's mother in her victim impact statement reportedly said, "No mother should have to know this is how her daughter's life ended, and by the hands of the very person who took a vow to love, honor, and cherish her. I can only hope that the rest of your life is filled with misery, loneliness, and despair." Now, Chrissy's father also had heartbreaking words to the man who likely asked for his blessing in the first place. Her father said during his victim impact statement, "She was my only child, my little girl, and my reason for living. Each day since her death has been a struggle to find meaning in a life that now feels empty." So Bradley was convicted in a bench trial, meaning no jury. The judge had final say, and that same judge who found Bradley Dawson guilty said, quote, "What should have been a truly joyous and memorable vacation was turned into a nightmare for the deceased and her family, causing much pain and sorrow to them. And Bradley's fate means he won't be leaving Fiji for a long time, likely the rest of his life. He was sentenced to a mandatory life in prison." Let's break this down with criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor Anthony Osso. Anthony, thank you so much for joining me today. Before we get into this sentence, what's your reaction to this case overall? I mean, Christy and Bradley were newlyweds, and then he beat her to death while they were on their honeymoon. What's your reaction to this horrible,
Gosh,
horrible story?
gruesome, um, and sort of appalled. Uh, Anytime you have a killing between two intimate partners, it's tragic. And this type of killing, a beating, is just so. It's a very up close and personal way to commit such a crime. So, really, just gruesome and a tragedy for her and the family.
And I think, going off just how gruesome this is, that not only stuck out to me, but especially because this happened to someone that you're supposed to love. Again, they were in their newlywed stage on their honeymoon, but her body was beaten so badly she couldn't even be embalmed. So my question to you is, given just how bad overall, the extent of her body was, the extent of the injuries, do you think it's possible Bradley may have been abusive to Christy before this incident happened?
A great question, Elizabeth, because I think one of the big things you want to look at in a situation like this is what was the relationship looking like, or what was it like leading up to this, right? Did it just happen overnight? And typically that's not the case. So I imagine that for something like this to take place, that there had to have been some abuse leading up to the murder.
And, this case was tried in Fiji, but say this case was tried in the United States. What type of charges do you think Bradley Dawson would have faced if he was charged and tried in the US? Do you think it might have been second degree murder, manslaughter, first degree murder, possibly? Where do you think that his charges would have faced had this been in the US?
Yeah, so it depends a lot on where he's being tried, what jurisdiction and what state. You know, but most likely when you've got a specific intent murder, meaning he intended to cause the death, you're likely looking at first degree murder. And so I imagine that he'd be facing very similarly, maybe a minimum of life or at least some punishment range where life sentence is included.
Yeah. And, Bradley's defense was an interesting one. And in my opinion, didn't really make any sense saying that she fell down and inflicted her own injuries after the two, were drinking, dancing the night before, all of that stuff. But what do you make of that defense? And as a criminal defense attorney, is that something you might have used that this was just a terrible accident?
On its face, I don't think that it is, as a defense attorney, the defense I would have personally gone with. Again, I have not been through the entire case file, but just based on what I'm seeing, um, like the judge said in the sentencing order, the injuries really were not consistent with a trip and fall. You've got bruises all over the body. You've got large wounds in several different places. So that's just inconsistent with falling. I think the more likely argument, if I'm in Fiji, is probably an identity argument. Now, if I'm in the United States, depending on what jurisdiction, that opens up a plethora of different arguments. For instance, was there some sort of sudden passion, or maybe even a self-defense argument, depending on what the actual physical evidence on the scene looked like.
And also too, it's hard to kind of claim an accident when you fled on a kayak to go to another island and you left behind your phone, your watch, so that way GPS couldn't track you, but then you were tracked down in the first place. So I want to ask you what your thoughts are on just the fact that it feels like Bradley took kind of extreme lengths to kind of try to get away with this. Again, taking that kayak in the middle of the night over to another island. What do you make of just his escape plan?
Sure, Elizabeth. I what I make of it, what I would argue when I was a prosecutor is that fleeing is a sign of a guilty conscience, and I think that's exactly what the judge took from it. Um, when they noted that, well, if you act in self, if there was an altercation and it wasn't a murder, then why did you go through so many lengths um, to get away, and why did you leave her body there to ultimately pass away? So I think that that kind of is evidence of his mindset.
Absolutely, because, just leaving your wife to be in her own pool of blood, just horrible, horrible. Are you surprised, given the defense in this case, or even that the defense claimed that this was an accident? Are you surprised that Bradley Dawson didn't take the stand, given that he said that this was all an accident? And say you were his attorney, would you have advised him to get on the stand?
Whether or not to put your client on the stand is a case by case situation. I think more times than not, you don't see defendants take the stand because they open themselves up to a plethora of questions, especially if you've got a good prosecutor on the other side. So I'm not surprised that they didn't put him on the stand. I think that the better argument would have been probably to point at the empty chair in the room. But if you meet with your client and you said that they could that they might do well, or that they have a legitimate alibi, then maybe that is the route I would have gone. But I don't think it's surprising he didn't take the stand, and I don't know that I would have put him on the stand.
Yeah, it could have definitely really kind of set him up, especially
Yeah.
given that he denied it in the first place. But given the overwhelming evidence pointing towards him, I think it would have probably been a bad idea too.
And
And obviously,
you can open the door to other types of evidence sometimes. So the defendant might make a misstatement, and you can open a can of worms that, as a defense attorney, you don't want to open. So just something to keep in mind.
exactly. For all the other people who might try to do this, just know that
Well,
this could
from
happen to them. Yeah. And of course, we know, Bradley was convicted in
yes.
Fiji, sentenced this month. But what's your reaction to the judge's statement in their ruling? It was a truly joyous and memorable vacation that was turned into a nightmare for the deceased and her family, causing much pain and sorrow to them. What do you make of that statement?
Having dealt with a lot of cases like this, I thought it was an interesting. I mean, I agree, right? It's a honeymoon in Fiji, and it should be a joyous and memorable experience. At the same time, I understand that one of the neighboring witnesses heard yelling and argument go on, and I find it hard to believe that this was the first instance of abuse by Mr. Dawson against Miss Chin. And I think, to kind of one of your earlier questions about if the case were to be tried in the United States, one of the big things that I would have the jury focus on is the nature of the relationship. And so, um, while it should have been a joyous vacation, I don't know what the reality of life was like for Miss Chen at that time.
And going back to your time as a former prosecutor, what was it like talking to victims' families, especially after, they give these very emotional, very heartfelt victim impact statements, again, because they've lost a loved one, a family member. In this case, this was Christy Chen's parents who were speaking to the judge and just giving those emotional statements. What is it like speaking with victims' family members when they're going through probably one of the worst moments of their lives?
I think it's arguably one of the most difficult parts of the job. And it's one of the most important parts of the job because your responsibility as a prosecutor is to seek justice for the victim, but also seek justice for the family members who are indirectly victims of any case. So I will say that when you can bring a positive verdict and some form of justice to a family, it does, it's rewarding. Um, but no verdict is ever going to heal the wound completely that that family's going through, and so it's always a difficult job.
Absolutely. And of course, our heart goes out to Christy Chen's family members and loved ones at this time. Anthony, also, I want to thank you so much for your insight into this case. I really appreciate it. Before we sign you off, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think we've covered most of it. Thanks for having me, Elizabeth.
Thank you again, Anthony. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
And Bradley Dawson will be eligible for parole after 18 years. According to reports, he does have 30 days to appeal his sentence.